Well, hello and welcome again to our reading of Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, and we're up to this next part of the story, verse 21, and this really is the story of Jairus' daughter and the woman who touched Jesus' garment, and it goes from up to verse 43. We'll probably do it in two sections. We have here an intertwining of two narratives which read like first-hand accounts and may be reminiscences of Peter. The two stories are intertwined in this way in all three of the Gospels. Exactly what connects them is not immediately obvious, but I'll mention as we go through one possible suggestion of how these two stories got intertwined and kept together. So we start with a genitive absolute, as Mark likes to do, and then a main verb. So and Jesus crossing back in the boat again, estoperon, to the other side. Remember, in the earlier story he went across the Sea of Galilee, and now he's crossing back again, and a great crowd, sunakthe, was gathered. This is aorist passive from sunago, to him, and he was beside the sea. Now we get his historic presence. Mark is very fond of these things. So one of the archisynagogon, these are the synagogue chiefs, probably the supervisor of the synagogue worship. They've got a technical Hebrew name, whose name was so Jairus by name. And having seen him, he falls, historic present, at his feet, and he beseeches him muchly. It's a shame we've lost that word muchly from English. It's very useful in translating Greek. So he besought him muchly, saying, hoti recitative, my daughter, eke eskatos. Now this is perfectly good classical Greek, and you'll see it in the New Testament quite a bit as well. It's echo plus an adverb, and you translate the echo as is. So my daughter is, well, we'd probably say here eskatos, at death's door. So she's in extremis, she's at the end of her life. Now we get this funny use of hina, the so-called imperatival use of hina. There's no genuine examples in classical Greek, but it begins to appear about 3rd century BC papyri and in 1st century texts. There are other examples of it in biblical Greek. So it's almost like please. So having come, please lay your hands aute on her. This is dative after the epi, in order that she might be saved. This is the aorist passive subjunctive from sozo, and she will live, and she might live. Again, this is subjunctive. The idea, unfortunately, perhaps in antiquity, was that if you were ill, it was because of some kind of punishment, and so therefore they used the word save rather than get better, the two ideas being much the same for them. And he went off with him. So Jesus went off with him, Jairus. And a great crowd was following him, akoluthio takes a dative, and they were pressing hard on him, and the woman being literally in a flow of blood. And of course this would render the woman unclean, which is probably why she approaches Jesus in this furtive way through the crowd. So this is from rusis, it's a third declension, connected with reo, to flow. So being with a flow of blood, the use of n here is perfectly acceptable classically as well, in a flow of blood for 12 years. Now, the daughter was also 12 years old, and this might be the connection between the two stories, that they both involve this number 12. The girl is 12 years old, the woman's been sick for 12 years. Remember, these early stories were probably passed on orally, so something like this, where the number 12 is involved in two stories, may be the reason why they got linked together. Just a suggestion. So for 12 years, and having suffered muchly, or perhaps suffered many things if you like, at the hands of many doctors, and having spent, this is a feminine participle from dap and nao, having spent tapanta, all the things from herself, so all her money, and having been helped, this is from ophalo, this is the aorist passive participle feminine, so we're getting lots of practice of our feminine participles here, which is good. This is from ophalo. And having been helped maiden in respect of nothing, so having not been helped at all, alamalon, but rather having come into that which is worse, so having become worse, we'd say in English, literally having come into the worse situation. Again, more feminine participles. Having heard regarding Jesus and having come into the crowd, opisen behind him, she touched his garment. For she was saying to herself, hoti, that if, now the Khan here is crassus for kai e'an, so this is kai, this is kai and e'an. We don't, this second e'an is redundant. We've already got one here. So the kai is important because it's even if I touch his garment, so they samai, I will be saved. So this is future passive from sozo. Now, so future passive from sozo, and immediately the flow of blood, that's the hemorrhage that she had, exeranthe, this is from xe rhino, is the verb here that you need to look up, which I think we may have had before, xe rhino. This is the aorist passive form, so it was dried up, so we might say the hemorrhage or the flow of blood was staunched, to use an English term. And egno, she knew, so she recognized in her body that iatai, now this actually is a perfect passive. You do get this, iaamai is a middle verb, and you do get the perfect middle of that one, which has the same sort of form. But this is in fact, it's the only example, I think, of the perfect passive in biblical Greek. So she was healed from her mastix. Now, a mastix is a whip, because again, in ancient times, they thought of illness as being a kind of punishment, and so she was healed from the punishment, so she's healed from her illness. You translate this as disease or illness. But there was this funny idea that if you became ill, it was a punishment by God. And Jesus immediately, we haven't had a euthus for a while, so there's a euthus, and immediately Jesus epignoscode, perceiving in himself, tain, now we need this is going with, if I can just line it up here, dunamin, so perceiving in himself, tain dunamin, the power, ex el thusan, feminine aorist participle, feminine agreeing with dunamin, dunamin, coming out ek from him, epistrephes, this is an aorist passive participle from epistrepho, having turned, we'd probably say to the crowd, literally it's in the crowd, that's just what it is there. So having turned to the crowd, he began to say, who touched my garment? And his disciples were saying to him, you see this crowd, this is a present participle, pressing hard upon you, and you say, who touched me? Now, interesting here, in Mark, the disciples are often portrayed in this disbelieving fashion, that they ask him, why are you asking such a silly question? When in fact, of course, it's not a silly question. And the disciples' protest is somewhat softened by Luke, And Matthew, who often does that, and Matthew just leaves it out completely. He doesn't like the idea of the disciples being spoken to quite so harshly, or being spoken about quite so harshly. So they're saying to Jesus, what on earth are you talking about? There's a crowd pressing on you. Why do you say, who touched me? And peri eblepeto, this is probably middle here, and he looked around, idain, to see the one having done this. So again, we've got a feminine participle here, feminine aorist participle, having done this, and the woman, well, terrified and trembling. This really is an hendiadys, that is two things, really two words for the same thing. It's quite common in biblical Greek, and it's classical Greek uses it sometimes as well. So the woman in fear and trembling, aidwia, this is the feminine participle from the past tense of oida. So this is aidwia. The oida is perfect in form but present in meaning, and so the participle ending is normally kos quia kos, and there's no kappa because of the delta here. So the woman having realized what had happened to her, she came and she fell before him, and she told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has saved you. Perfect from sozo. Hupage es erenein, go in peace. This, of course, is a Hebrew expression, something like laki shalom. So go in peace. And isti, this is the imperative from the verb to be well from your illness, from your disease. So be healed from your disease. And that's the first part of this section.